Who are the characters behind science? This is Science Behind the Glass, illuminating the human side.
In this podcast, we unveil the human side of laboratories and science. Scientists share personal experiences and we discuss their meanings from different perspectives and fields of research.
Welcome to Science Behind the Glass, illuminating the human side, the podcast that unveils the secrets behind people, stories, and misunderstood animals. Across cultures and centuries, snakes have been both feared and revered. For the ancient Egyptians, they were symbols of protection and life. Indigenous from Amazon and Australian stories, serpent spirits gave the shape to rivers and lands. Yet, in Western lore, snakes became icons of sin and shame, creatures to be avoided, not understood.
Our guest today is someone who's reshaping how we see the natural world. Dr. Christina Zdenek is a herpetologist, venom researcher, science communicator, and fearless field scientist whose work bridges the gap between humans and wildlife. From Australia's most venomous snakes to its rarest parrots, Christina has led groundbreaking conservation projects, including studies on dead adders, the iconic Palm Cockatoos, and even global research into how people perceive snakes. Through science, storytelling, and immersive fieldwork, she challenges fears with curiosity and transforms misunderstanding into respect. Christina invites us to see the intelligence, beauty, and vital role of animals so often cast in the shadow.
Cristina, welcome to Science Behind the Glass. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you.
Yes, nice to meet you. And to start with the podcast, we want to know where was born that curiosity and passion for snakes.
So for me, my obsession with wildlife began when I was a very little girl, as old as I can remember, in fact. And instead of having a dog or a cat as a pet, we had a boa constrictor. It was a very large snake, freaking huge. And my mom was actually terrified that it was going to physically consume me because I was this little girl. But of course, I just was fascinated. And growing up in a very large city, we're talking millions and millions of people, this is Los Angeles, I didn't really have access to much nature. So for me, it was really important to be able to have access on a daily basis inside my own home to observe behaviors that I would never get a chance to do so out in the bush. So after having that snake, fortunately, my parents, they were flexible and accommodated my obsession with reptiles, and I would just catch things from my backyard and then keep them for a little while, or out in the bush and then feed them, get to learn about them. And yeah, just being able to keep reptiles as pets enabled me to just watch them endlessly and became totally fascinated. And that's where my love of reptiles and extending on to wildlife thereafter began.
Wow, that's amazing. That I don't think that my mom would have allowed me to have these kind of animals.
I'm grateful for them.
Yeah, that's right. It sounds very interesting and unusual as well. And to continue, can you share how working with snakes and birds might change the view that someone has on the interaction between humans and wildlife?
Yeah, so the human wildlife conflict is a serious major problem around the world. And where we often focus on these sorts of conflicts is with bears, tigers, leopards, cougars, these sorts of really big, elephants, charismatic species. But actually, in terms of interactions with humans, snakes is number one, and yet it's not really talked about. And it's a very controversial and sort of sensitive topic because it goes into the realm of people having snake phobia. And without having those interactions and really being able to understand the animal at all, and they're so dissimilar to humans, it can really exacerbate this conflict and have this negative perceptions in someone's mind to the point where it almost just like explodes and they have this terrible overreaction when they encounter a snake themselves. Because this lack of like knowledge base on snakes, as an example for the human wildlife conflict, it creates this massive void that's just readily filled by fear-mongering, myth and misinformation. And so people have this perception in their mind, but it's actually just the wrong one. And it's not until they really have some interaction, which is rare with a snake, that they realize that everything that they've been told is actually wrong. And that's what we're finding with some of my research. Is really interesting. We might get into a little bit later.
Yeah. And that you mentioned is very curious, because actually for some cultures, like really ancient cultures and some indigenous communities, for them snakes represents life and rivers, and is a symbol of like a health, and even like the symbol of health, and is a snake. But then in other cultures, more exactly the Western ones, they change all this perception with the snakes. And then, of course, with colonization, that changed all the narratives. Of course, the incidents didn't help about it. And as you said, like the ignorance about it and how we interact with them, or why they act in the way they act. And that changed also the perception. So I haven't said that you also investigate the snake venom population, antivenom research. What's the human health connection in your snake work? How does it matter to people? How we can disentangle this?
That's a really great question. And I guess the first thing that I'll state is that science and research doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, have to directly benefit humans in order to be valuable. In fact, there's been a lot of accidental discoveries when just scientists are allowed to do their work and follow their discoveries and interests. So, some examples are X-rays or penicillin, or even Viagra. So that's the first thing I'd like to state. Now, with venom in particular, venom is a huge topic, and there's tens of thousands of different proteins and peptides, if not millions, right? So each snake can have between 20 and 50 different proteins and peptides, and each and every one of them will have a very specific target, evolutionarily developed over millions of years. And if you think about it from a drug design perspective and drug discovery perspective, that's what you want out of a drug. You want it to be targeted, and you want it to not have any of those side effects, right? So venom is a really good way to sort of shortcut our discovery of potentially helpful therapeutic drugs, or even diagnostic tests or laboratory tools, because they're biologically active compounds, right? They have the right conformation of shape, series of amino acids that give them that bioactivity of interest. So a perfect example is lupus. It's a terrible, debilitating autoimmune disease that humans get. And in order to start treating this disease, first step is to diagnose it, just like any other. And in order to diagnose it, currently right now, the best way is known is to actually use taipan venom on the sample of blood to determine whether they've got lupus. So it's that in combination with Echis carinatus, a soft scale viper venom. And it's because those venoms are sensitive to a drop in something called phospholipid, and that's in our blood. And that's what lupus is. That condition is having autoimmune response and attacking the phospholipids in your blood and preventing you from being able to clot properly, which can lead to a whole suite of different types of symptoms. Really problematic for people. But you can start to treat it as soon as you're diagnosed. And these venoms, that's just one great example to diagnose diseases, is lupus. But, there's other examples of different venom toxins that have been used as like a scaffold for drugs currently in existence. A perfect big example is captopril, and that reduces the blood pressure, which, high blood pressure leads to heart disease, which is the number one killer of humans in the world. So there's actually quite a lot of connections of venom to human health and research in that regard.
Yeah, that is amazing. And yeah, actually, rarely this connection between health and and the snakes is considered by most people. And in that matter, or continue with that line, you also investigate or research how snakes hear or how they sense vibrations. What
Mm.
those experiments reveal, and do you think these results may help to change people perception on snakes?
I think that the more research in general that we do on snakes, the better off we'll be because we're filling a knowledge base that I said before. Otherwise, is readily, that void is readily filled by misinformation. So that's the first point. And secondly, I I just really couldn't believe that that study had not been done. Looking how snakes respond, like as in free moving snakes, not ones that are partially anesthetized with like electrodes in their brain, sort of thing. How free moving snakes respond to airborne sound, because of course, snakes do have ears. It's just internal ears, not external ears. Just think, not very similar, but broadly speaking, to dolphins or moths. And some of these are, you know, they can distinguish individualized vocalizations, that sort of thing. So I had actually studied vocalizations in parrots, and so I was a little bit intrigued in this sort of space. And then working with snakes, I thought, oh, let's do this study. So we actually looked at it was 19 snakes across 16 genera. And so previously, first of all, no one had studied free moving snakes in this regard, but also they'd only studied one species. So we wanted to see how it would change, how those reactions would change across different genera, different, groups of snakes. So like taipans versus womas versus brown snakes versus death adders, right? So yeah, we ran that study, and okay, so what did we found? Well, after several years of working, we were in like 305 different trials. It took us weeks. We had to do it at 27 degrees temperature, which was pretty hot. So all of us, such as indoors, were sweating the whole time. But the snakes were happy and they could behave as they wanted. There was a great collaborative team effort. So it was like a combination of the science, arts, and industry together. A really good example of them coming together. But we found that the snakes responded more similarly to other snakes in their genus compared with other snakes in different genera. So a brown snake was more likely to behave similarly to another species of brown snake versus, say, a death adder. And so that was the first big result, is that there's probably like this evolutionarily, those snakes evolved to behave in a certain way. And it's probably to do with whether they're active foragers, whether they're ambush predators, their foraging mode. Also how big the snake gets, right? So behavior can change over the course of the snake's life in terms of how defensive it is. Now, what we found, interestingly, is that the woma pythons, which get really big, and they're semi-arboreal species, live in the arid interior of Australia, non-venomous, being python, we found that they actually exhibited a lot of curiosity-type behaviors. So they would go up and periscope, and they would sometimes go toward the speaker as well. And so rather than having sort of defensive behavior like we saw out of the brown snakes, they were more so curious and unafraid of that sound signal. The brown snakes were an interesting point. So the genus Cedonia, it was all or nothing. And that's really what is mirrored when you encounter them in the bush. They will basically stay in crypsis as long as possible, trying to avoid a confrontation. They might sort of stand up and hiss and just show that aplasmatic coloration in the S shape facing up to try to bluff you out of attacking it. But when you cross that threshold, boom, they've decided. And so that's what we found. They were either didn't move at all, or if they did, they moved the furthest. So that was quite interesting. And the last one that I'll touch on, I'll talk about taipans. And they were quite spooked by the sound. They didn't like it. They exhibited a lot of defensive type behaviors. There was hissing, dropping of the lower jaw, these subtle type behaviors. I had to look with binoculars from behind this sort of half wall, just leaning down, not moving, of course, not making a sound. And yeah, they did not like it. They would tend to move away if they did move at all in response to the sound. And the other cool behavior is what it's called the fixed gaze or fixation type behavior, where it will stare at you, or in this case, the sound, and their body would coil and they would maybe move sideways, but still keep their eyes trained on that stimulus. And they're like ready to strike, basically. So very cool and interesting results.
What type of sound do you expose them? Different types or ultrasounds, or was
Yeah, great question. So the media would loved had we played some music. Oh, how did they respond to Bill Joel or whatever it was? But from a scientific perspective, we could only do so many trials, and that song would have, or any song would have gone up and down, in and out of a lot of different frequencies. We wanted to know, okay, in this frequency, can they hear in this frequency? And so we did a range of frequencies all at once, and it's called pink noise, and you have the same amount of energy throughout all the frequencies. And so what does it sound like to a human? Well, it was like, or the higher pitched one, so 0 to 300, not decibels, but hertz. Decibels was the amplitude, and we did that at 85, so about someone screaming would be how loud. But anyway, and then we did 300, every 150 we did, up to 500 from memory. We had 3 sets of sounds anyway. And so the higher up one would go, so that's kind of what it sounded like. Wow. And we did have different responses across those sounds, and whether they actually felt, whether there was ground vibrations as well, because we actually measured ground vibrations at the first sound. Even though we tried to limit them, they were still there. But sounds 2 and 3, so the next higher up ones, did not have any ground vibrations, and we were still seeing this behavioral changes as opposed to the control when we had no sound.
And do you think that this has an effect, people, they can't hear, when people is approaching, or perhaps they can't perceive in a better way, or people can, change the perceptions now that they know that they can't hear these sounds?
I think so. How we interact with snakes, I don't know about you, but I've got 35 snakes personally, and so we now talk to them, and it was really interesting. We even convinced ourselves, we weren't sure what we were going to find, but we think, yeah, they're more aware, and they're using more senses than what we thought. And whilst I can't give you any really direct advice on how to use this in whatever country you're in, I think it just gives us some helpful perspective. If, in the least, if you want to make a snake aware that you're there, it's not just ground vibrations, but you can speak as well, and that could help your cause. But yeah, every situation's different, and also different species might react differently to sound. But it's a starting point, and like always, you need more research.
Yes. For example, I'm not an expert in snakes, obviously, but with the spiders, each species have a communication through vibrations, and they can, as you said, they recognize themselves, especially between them, males and females. So the frequency that they recognize between even closest species, they can tell apart if it's one from one particular species or another one. So it's their I would say that's fingerprint that they use.
I think we're just really scratching the surface on trying to understand animals and animal behavior and animal intelligence. There's so much more to it. The more we look, the more we uncover, the more we realize things are much more intelligent and conscious as well. Having a self-awareness, there's all sorts. It's just our limitation is our funding for these sorts of research, but also our minds. We're only see the world in our Umwelt is a German word to describe it, but based off of our senses. But everything else senses the world in a different way, or a lot of things sense the world differently than how we do it. The spiders feeling their little fingers, or with a platypus having electromagnetic, these receptors, or chemoreceptors. There's all sorts of different ways of perceiving the world. It's up to researchers to try to put themselves in the shoes of their species rather than through our own perspective of how we view and interpret the world.
Yeah, you're right. I think that also that will open more like I guess that the bias that we have with animals, and
Yes.
then trying to understand them in a better way, not just putting limitations based on what we perceive, I guess. And
Yeah.
you're also running what you described as the world's largest survey across 20 plus countries on human perceptions of snakes. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about what is this project about, and what patterns have you seen, and what any surprises related to cultural differences?
Yeah, thanks for this. It's called Under the Snakefluence. That's the project. And we're operating in over 20 countries. So it is the largest human snake conflict study ever undertaken, as far as I know. Definitely published. So what we're doing is we're looking at snake education events, and we're looking at how people, well, we're surveying people at snake education events, and we're trying to work out what are the correlations with people, what is filling their perceptions of snakes, and how is that affecting their behavior around snakes. What sort of knowledge base do they have with regards to first aid, and just world type beliefs about snakes in the environment? Do they think that they should all be eradicated, or that we should be proud that our area has snakes because it's going to be a functioning ecosystem? So those are sorts of questions that we're asking people around the world, and we're targeting that at education events with people who we've recruited to be partners on this project. And we wanted to make sure we heavily vetted each of these snake educators to make sure that they were giving basically good education, evidence-based education about snakes. And the other really interesting part of this work is trying to understand how well snake education events are doing in terms of improving people's perceptions of snakes. Are they still likely to try to kill a snake after that snake education event? And what different elements about that education event is the best determinant of the biggest improvement of snake perception? Because in the end, it's, snake conservation, it's about preserving habitat. And, a person killing the odd snake here or there, that to me is not really about snake conservation, but really about preventing snake bite for humans. Like, it's a human safety issue. When someone tries to kill a snake out of fear, then that's when they're basically inviting a retaliatory defensive bite from that snake. So that's what we're trying to prevent, is people trying to kill snakes. So a bit of coexistence is what we're hoping to achieve with that paper. Now, I haven't answered the end part of your question, but you can chime in there.
How do you do the following up to see if the perception of the person changed or the community changed regarding the snakes?
Typical way that we can do this is just by surveying them immediately after the event. So the event's at least an hour, up to 8 hours. Like some events that I was running is venomous snake handling courses, like just on the weekend. We trained 15 members of the community on safe and ethical snake handling. And so, as part of this research, I'd survey them before that course and then immediately after. We have a potential to possibly check their perceptions a year later, but we actually haven't come to that point just yet. We only stopped our data collection in July, just at the end of World Snake Week.
That's amazing. And actually, I want to ask you, do you see how do you communicate this with different cultures? Because I imagine that they have different languages. So do you have do you perceive differences, of course, in like a communication, or someone was like a liaison between you or the team that you were working did in that way the perception was different? Because when someone explains in your own language, it's very different with explaining in another one.
100%. This was a real challenge with this type of work, being so global in nature. And it's really no wonder that the work hasn't been done before, because it's been an immense amount of work, I'll tell you. And shout out to my project managers, Owen Buckhuber and Poppy Wyndham, because without having project managers, I wouldn't have been able to manage this big project. So one of the things, to get to your question, Dr. Linda, is we had to have the survey translated to 8 different languages. And that was to enable it to work in all the countries. So in some countries, they were fine with using English, like the Philippines, for example, and all the countries in Europe. But other ones, like Malawi, as example, we needed to have that translated. And so our snake educators, we had them lead this as part of their contribution. We weren't able to pay for any translators. We actually were running this entire project with no grant, because no one likes to fund snake research because they don't like snakes. So same thing was that Soundgarden paper, how snakes respond to airborne sounds. That was just done all off the back of our own money, free time, that sort of thing. Yeah, so our snake educators, we would just have them translate it, but we needed them to collaborate with another person as a gauge of whether they translated it exactly accurately. And once they both agreed upon every word, because that can really affect people's responses, then that's the translation that we used.
Yeah, I guess that is crucial. And I want to revisit a little bit your behavior studies. You also work with a much more charismatic species, the palm cockatoo. And I
Yeah.
understand you discover some tool usage, like they use something to create this percussion or drumming rhythms. How did this project come about, and what surprised you the most about it?
Well, would you believe me if I told you that the Palm Cockatoo project came out of snakes? It doesn't seem like it. So I won a Fulbright fellowship to come from America to study snakes up on Cape York Peninsula with Professor Rob Heinzen. And partway through us developing the proposals and things like that, well, I was thinking of grant applications and permits at that stage. So I was already over here, got the Fulbright, they're paying for me to be here. We came to the conclusion that snakes wouldn't really be a good umbrella species in any way, and they're really limited on their distribution across Cape York Peninsula, far north Queensland. So, but there was this alternative species that really lived across this whole beautiful landscape and was probably endangered, but no one had studied enough to determine that. And we could probably win grants. So from a practical perspective of the finances, but also the conservation aspect, we shifted from green pythons to palm cockatoos. So that's how the Palm Cockatoo project originally started in 2009. And my obsession with snakes and conservation. Yeah, so deep down, I really just wanted to do as best for conservation, as most that I could do for conservation as possible. So in terms of how the project began, like sort of specifically on the topics we needed to look at, was basically trying to understand more about this really difficult to study species. And one of the main problems was we couldn't identify individuals. So there's so many different demographic parameters we weren't able to get, which would directly feed into a population viability analysis, which directly feeds into the conservation status. Us being able to predict that the population is likely to go extinct in X number of years, business as usual. So we tried to identify individuals based on their vocalizations because we couldn't capture this giant bird. They're like, 65 centimeters, this huge, can't even see the bottom. It doesn't even fit in the screen. They're massive things. And yeah, they probably wouldn't like being handled either, and they would remember it forever because they're super smart. And so you probably wouldn't be able to capture the bird again. Lots of trouble. And so, yeah, we started out with vocalizations, and that quickly turned into the most interesting thing about palm cockatoos being their drumming behavior. And so I set out to try to observe and video as many different drumming events as possible with this bird. And I failed initially. The first year I didn't get any. I sort of saw it a few times. They're such wary birds, hey. They're super xenophobic and they just fly away. And it just took, I don't know whether I got better at it over time or whether the birds got used to me. Maybe a bit of both, or maybe they just got used to me. And yeah, I did get a real sense of that over time of certain birds that I was, sort of chasing over time would start to accept me. And this knew that I was of no harm to them. And that was quite special to be able to really get that sense when, they're doing, making a stick in a tree and trying to formulate, like fashion a drumstick. And then instead of flying over that way, would fly directly over my head because I'm at a hollow. Like there's some wild experiences with this massive, super intelligent bird, and to observe that drumming behavior. I think I filmed it like 72 times in the end. Over the course of multiple years, but on average, it would take me about 100 hours of field work, trekking through grass this tall, just to get one drumming event on camera. So it was not low-hanging fruit whatsoever. And that's probably why, despite it being super iconic and charismatic, and just like the poster species for Cape York, why no one had ever succeeded at uncovering the mystery of his drumming behavior.
And they do this for mating?
Well, that's what everyone likes to think, and the media loves to say that. But
twisting the plot.
Real, yeah. Look, they do it for two reasons. Pair bonding is one of them, and that's about half the time. And it's them getting the timing right of breeding and communicating to each other that they're ready to breed, that they have enough fat stores, the right hormones flowing, and that sort of thing, that they've got the hollow, this big old growth tree hollow, vertically piped, that they have ownership of it. A lot of things, a lot of boxes need to be ticked, and they can mate and breed just about any time of the year. So they really need a way to signal to each other. So pair bonding, drumming behavior, that helps with that. But the second major, about 50% of the time they use drumming is actually for joint territorial defense. So these old growth tree hollows are super rare in the landscape, especially the ones perfectly suited for this really big bird. Sort of by the time they get to that vertically piped stage, they've been through so many fires, cyclones, they're 300 plus years old, that they're super vulnerable to any old fire that comes through, whether it be small or big. And so there's like this small window of availability of when a tree might be suitable for them. So they're rare in the landscape, and they're willing to fight to the death for it. And I've certainly watched some epic battles between males. So this whole drumming behavior, coming back to your question, it's alerting nearby pairs, particularly males, that this territory is taken. This is mine. I have a strong enough bill. I can make this really hard drumstick and bang it up, and you can hear that this is a strength of power for them. Like it's like an army running, going together in unison. It's very, it's intimidating, I suppose, to a nearby male. Like, don't you dare try to usurp my hollow. It's not up for grabs.
Wow, that's amazing. So cool.
Yeah, it sounds beautiful, and the footage must be really nice.
Speaking about this beautiful, amazing bird, the palm cockatoo, this work led to status upgrades and influence in mining environmental assessment. How do you navigate from the data to policy impact? How does Australia go in terms of conservation and fund?
Yeah, look, it's a long journey, I'll put it that way, to start with. So you got to be in it for the long haul. But you can probably shortcut it by first literally downloading the forms from the government websites to see what exactly it is, like what criteria you need to hit and prove with your species that would satisfy XYZ conservation status. So there's very particular wording. And unless your scientific paper comes out and is like robust, like meeting those specific criteria, you're not going to get there. So I would recommend starting at the end, seeing where you're trying to head, even just beyond conservation status. But for instance, these it's a little bit off topic, but rodenticides. If you are publishing a paper on trying to get these second generation super toxic anticoagulant rodenticides off the market because they're killing non-target species and endangered species and all the rest of it in Australia, if researchers are trying to prove that this is a problem, literally you would download the forms that would prove that this is a key threatening process in the EPBC. So you have to know the process, is my point. So the governmental process to get your end result, whether it be that conservation status or list the anticoagulant rodenticides as a key threatening process through the EPBC Act. Literally just download the forms and read those words very carefully. And then that can actually guide your work in how you would design your paper. Do you need to have it wider spread than what it is because you need to prove it's at the national scale? Or, should you study a different species because you need to prove that they might go into a higher endangered level? Or does it already need to be endangered? It would totally change how you'd go about the paper. So I'd say start at the end.
Yeah, that's right. It's quite unusual to find scientific papers like written in this language that is more approachable for stakeholders and that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
And that's why they say co-design it as well. So the stakeholder that you hope is going to pay attention to your paper once you've spent years and published it and you're like, here, please use my paper. You should have started with them 2 years ago and say, how should we design a paper so it will be helpful for your management?
It's very disconnected, the part of the government and the policies working together with the scientists.
It is. We need to get out of our silos.
Yes. Yes. And the idea is that the communication be straightforward and then it goes in both ways, right?
And that way it makes more use of small amount of funds, especially in the conservation space. You see it in grants that they're really looking for co-design projects, ones that are working with Indigenous groups, ones that have letters of support. Like I, for instance, applied 1 year, 2 years in a row. First year I was denied a threatened species grant in Queensland. And the difference between the 2 years was I didn't include letters of support the first year. We stated that we had these people on board, and that was the truth. But we actually just didn't have the letter saying it. And it was just a simple thing. And they're just finding any way to knock you back. It was basically the same application next year with a few letters of support, and bang, we got it.
The theme ecological grief, loss of species and habitats, is increasingly discussed. Do you experience that in your fieldwork and research? How do you cope or channel into that?
Yeah, this is very common, and I've now been at conferences where they had ecological grief sessions. And one of the big keys that I remember for one of the sessions is to talk about it and to talk with other researchers of what they're feeling. Say what you're feeling. They need to say how they're feeling, that sort of thing. So to get to your question, though, I think I put a bit of a bubble around myself in order to protect myself mentally, enable myself to continue going, because I know I need to keep fighting that good conservation fight, like no matter what. I just need to keep going. So for me, I think that bubble helps. That's the best way I can describe it, but prevents the sort of ecological grief from happening. I get very frustrated when things are happening really slowly, and I realize, as in conservation outcomes are happening slowly. Meanwhile, all of the habitat destruction and all these impacts on wildlife is happening so rapidly. So I definitely have a lot of frustrations there. But when I do like get depressed about the state of the planet and the environment, I think of two things. One, this is one of the reasons why I didn't want to have kids. I didn't feel it was very suitable to bring children up in this day age. And so, like, it's not like I'm depressed that my kids are going to have to deal with this. Yes, it's sad, other kids and my nieces and nephews, but it just will hit you harder if it's your own progeny, right? So I don't have that. So that's good. That's good for me. The second thing, I take a step back and look at it from a geological time frame perspective. And what I mean by that is, like, I'm a lecturer into biodiversity and conservation. And we look at the topic as a whole, including, you know, previous 5 mass extinction events that have happened. It's either from a meteor or a volcano event or something like that. But the current mass extinction event is happening right now. It's the 6th mass extinction event, the only one done by a species, and that is humans. But if you look at the recovery of Earth and species, it has happened after each of those mass extinction events. So we're in one now, and recovery will happen. It's just not necessarily in our lifetime or multiple generations of human lifetime. So Earth will go on, right? And there will be, greater speciation further along. It's just the quality of life for humans, and that is definitely going to drop. Yeah, so that perspective, that longer term perspective, might help some people. It does for me. It's still incredibly sad. Like, I don't want a single species to go extinct. I don't want another tree to be cut down. Like another forest. It just boggles my mind that that's still happening.
I think that is
Geological
this is very
perspective.
impressive because actually, yeah, I agree with you. And also the one of the follower that I decided not to have kids to have a contribution less
Yeah.
consumption and production. And then I was very
Yes.
aware of how we are now, but it's my personal choice. And also, but I sometimes find it tricky, and it's like, oh, I would like to do more, and then there's small changes. But then
Yeah.
I think that if we fall in this, like, oh, there's nothing to do, and we can't do absolutely anything else, it's not going to change anyhow. If we fall in that way of thinking, I don't think that we are not going to change anything, not in the present, not in future generations. So I think that's what it's like. Well, it's a small contribution, but doesn't matter. Let's change.
Yeah. It all adds up. And also the ripple effect. Was it John Donne, the famous poet? No man is an island, right? No person, we should say, but that's how he said it. That we all impact those around us, and whether it be our family, our friends, our coworkers, and they see how you behave, and we're all part of the social norm. Like, we create the social norm, and you can see this is why generations are very different. Gen X versus Gen Y, Z. They're all really different because they're all influenced in a certain way, and the political arena in which they're born into, and the extent of civilization, and all sorts of factors, right? But the education about the environment is only ramped up, and we're realizing how much negative impact that we're having on the planet. And but yeah, people, it's going in the right direction. It's just, yeah, some governments and a lot of corruption and big international companies needing to be reined in. But on the individual level, I think, yeah, people are well and truly more aware. But I agree with you, Linda. Do what you can, and if everyone does, that's all of a sudden a big impact. And then if people are sharing it on social media, that gets bigger again. And who knows, you could be inspiring a lot of people.
Yeah, that's right. It's really hard to reconcile these emotions with your work and everything, but maybe other sides of the work can help. For example, a science communicator and as a science ambassador, you have visited remote places and communities. What is the role of indigenous knowledge or community participation in your work?
Look, I've worked with Indigenous mobs across Cape York and elsewhere, yeah, for going on 17 years. And it's been, yeah, an absolute great privilege to do so. And there's little bits and bobs you get here and there. Some knowledge it's for them and they can't pass on, and you just have to like respect that and the sort of thing. One interesting thing in particular that really stuck with me is talking with an elder about snake bite and their community. You know, it's just an interesting thing. How would they deal with snake bite and that sort of thing? Because they didn't have compression bandages and they didn't have antivenom. Could they still survive by what they did? You know, this is something that they did. And yeah, one of these elders said that they would bury a person flat, lay them down, and partially bury them, and it sort of makes sense. So you're mobilizing the person, which we know is really helpful for reducing your heart rate and the blood flow and the venom going all around your body. But also a bit of compression. You know, if you do have a little bit of pressure all over the body, then that might be slowing the lymphatic flow of venom and give your body a chance to, you know, attack and deal with these toxins in a sublethal dose. And so, of course, there would have been deaths, but maybe a few more survived because they worked that out. And it's really good principles too. Like when I, you know, train people on like first aid in our snake handling courses, we say, well, look at how the Indigenous used to do it, and there's some principles that we can extrapolate from that, particularly if you're out in a remote area and you don't have the ideal scenario around you. You haven't got, I don't know, a sat phone or reception. And if you didn't have a bandage, what would you do? You know, and I tell those stories. It's always good to, if we can, and yeah, incorporate Indigenous knowledges from around the world, and hopefully can keep those cultures alive, well, and thriving. You know, keep their habitat intact if they're, you know, a hunter-gatherer type society. I think they're incredibly valuable. We'll probably only just scratch the surface of the knowledge that they've got, you know, in terms of plant extracts, and yeah, it's probably got the cure to cancer and all sorts of things in the plants that they're using in very specific ways. And you know, we see that through a lot of the drug design and development coming actually from plants, and a lot of it's derived from Indigenous knowledge. So.
Yeah, hopefully this that knowledge we can work together with that knowledge and try to encourage them and empower these communities and work together for a better science, I would say, and breaking those barriers.
Yeah, and not just extrapolate, or extract rather, not just extract. That's a new form of colonization, isn't it? To just like
Yes.
take the knowledge and not give them any credit for it. You know, that's happened time and time again, and I think we can all agree that's wrong.
Yes, the importance of bringing together and working together in a project instead of just using the places or their lands or their sites or their knowledge and just publishing or using the extractivism or applying for grants.
Yeah, there's
That's
some good movements in this space, like in you know, bush chopper for Indigenous Australians. You know, there's some really big money makers coming out, and they're, you know, they're the ones receiving the grants from government to develop their food product. Yeah,
yeah.
so
Yeah, here in
good
Cairns, I don't
stuff.
know if you heard about we have the director of the Center of Excellence for Indigenous
Okay.
Environmental Futures. Professor Sean he was telling us about his experiences. He's archaeologist, and his experiences with the indigenous communities, and they are working together, and they design all the methodologies together. And how actually is the other way around? It's not like you propose a project, but
Good.
actually they propose the project, and the ways and the methods are completely different to the Western side of the as we do the things, and actually we learn so much from them. So he was explaining what is the difference and what is the issues that still needs to be addressed. So yeah, that's amazing that you have this experience with these communities. And and to
It's a great
finalize,
story.
we want you to invite you to give us a message for scientists, for people that is invested and actually wants to work on the conservation and wants to bridge this rigorous science with
Mm.
public engagement and with the real work impact. What advice could you give them, or what message?
Yeah, great. Hang out with old people would be one of the big ones. They know so much. So whether it be Indigenous or non-Indigenous, for me, they're just my elders, right? If I want to go learn about birds, I just go hang out with these oldies, and they just know every call, and they have a million stories, and there's so much knowledge there, right? So really respecting our elders across all cultures, to me, is a really big one. Read lots of books. So much knowledge out there. Just soak it up like a sponge, right? And like I would say attend lots of events as well. You're all sorts of local in person, because you never know who you're going to meet there, who you're going to be inspired by. That will really fill your cup and keep you going. I think it's a difficult space to navigate, to find jobs in, to keep mentally well in, and I think those are really uplifting types of events. So even things like local revegetation groups all around the world. There's, I mean, even like just across Brisbane area where I'm at, there's all these different community groups where they're doing local reveg, and it can feel daunting, all the problems and all the negative impacts happening to the natural world, and to know that you're weeding that plant and you're improving habitat and you're doing what you can. I think that's really empowering. So that's what I would, I think, recommend. And if you want to make good impressions at these types of areas, events and stuff, and you want to maybe get a job, arrive early. Simple thing, but it goes a long way, and you seem dependable, and you can have some great conversations. A small little tidbit.
That sounds
Yeah, nice.
fantastic. Yes. Thank you very much, Christina. It has been a pleasure having you here. Thank you for your
Thank you
time,
for having me.
for sharing all your experience, your knowledge.
So thank you for doing all of that.
This episode was inspired by Christina's mission to reveal the relationship between humans and wildlife, and by the groundbreaking conservation and science communication work she is leading across Australia and beyond. Dr. Christina Zdenek invites us to step beyond fear and into curiosity, challenging the myths around snakes and celebrating the intelligence, beauty, and ecological importance of animals often misunderstood. From Venom to birdsong, her work shows how science and empathy can help us to coexist more peacefully with the wild world around us.
We are also excited to share that Science Behind the Glass now lives on a new platform that connects the podcast to all major streaming services via RSS. Just click the link in the description to find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, and wherever you love to listen your podcast. Science Behind the Glass, Illuminating the Human Side is an independent podcast created and hosted by me, Daniel Esguerra, and Linda Hernandez, with the invaluable support of our dedicated technical director, Rafael Giordano, and the original music by our colleague and friend, Bernardo Aguila.
Follow us on Instagram, X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok, and visit our website for more stories, updates, and resources. Don't forget to subscribe and share this podcast with your friends and communities. Let's amplify these essential narratives together. And if this episode inspired you, consider supporting us with a contribution via PayPal. Just click the Support Us button on our website. Your support helps us to grow and ensures we continue illuminating the human side of science. Until next time.